Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going on a deep dive into a topic that's both fascinating and a little bit creepy, to be honest. We're going to be talking about the history of witchcraft beliefs and prosecutions.
Ooh, sounds a bit spooky.
Yeah, and we're lucky enough to be working with excerpts from the Oxford Handbook of Witchcraft, so we're tapping into some real scholarly expertise here.
That's right. We're talking about centuries when witchcraft wasn't just like, a Halloween decoration or a spooky story. It was something people genuinely feared and, sadly, something that had serious consequences.
Yeah, like trials and executions. We're talking about the real deal.
Exactly. It was a very real concern, especially across Europe and the Americas.
So let's get into it then. What did it actually take to get someone convicted of witchcraft back then? I was reading through this and it seems a lot more complex than just, pointing a finger and yelling witch.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was a much more intricate process.
So give us the breakdown.
Well, think of it this way. Successful prosecutions often needed like this collaboration between everyday people and the courts. You had rumors and suspicions swirling around in the community,
Okay.
and you needed the legal authority of the courts to kind of formalize those accusations and turn them into convictions.
So it's like a two-pronged attack. You've got the villagers and then you've got the courts.
Precisely. And on the one hand, you've got the villagers who truly believed that witches were behind all sorts of misfortunes, like sudden illnesses or bad harvests, or even like when the milk went sour.
Right. Everything bad that happened, there must be a witch behind it.
Exactly. It was like a catch-all explanation for the unexplainable.
So, okay, the villagers bring the initial spark, they bring the suspicion, but what did the courts get out of this? Like, why were they so willing to actually listen to these accusations and take action?
Well, remember, we're talking about a time when religious authority held like enormous sway over society. Theologians and legal experts, they were deeply concerned about the spiritual implications of witchcraft. They saw witches as not just causing harm in a physical sense, but also engaging in this spiritual crime
Okay.
by consorting with the devil.
Mm.
So for them, it was a way to demonstrate their commitment to fighting evil.
Right. So by prosecuting witches, they were basically saying, hey, we're the good guys. We're protecting you from this evil threat.
Exactly. They were asserting their power, maintaining social order, and really kind of upholding religious orthodoxy.
So it was about control.
Yeah, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is that the lines between these perspectives weren't always so black and white.
You mean it wasn't just superstitious villagers versus the all-knowing courts?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was much more intertwined than that. Most people, even in rural communities, believed in the devil and his influence. But the trials themselves often acted as this sort of public education platform. Sermons given during trials, the interrogations of suspected witches, it all kind of shaped how people understood and even defined witchcraft.
So it's like by prosecuting witches, they were actually spreading the very beliefs they were trying to control.
Exactly. It's this fascinating cyclical dynamic. And to truly grasp how these beliefs took root, we need to consider how even the most outlandish ideas, like witches flying, were products of, both popular folklore and evolving theological concepts.
Wait, so you're telling me that those images of witches, soaring through the night sky on their broomsticks, that wasn't just some storyteller making things up?
Well, the image itself might have originated in folklore, but theological ideas about the devil's power really kind of amplified it.
Go on.
If the devil could tempt and corrupt souls, well, surely he could also grant his followers supernatural abilities.
Right, like defying gravity.
Precisely. It wasn't just about ignorant superstition. Even the fantastical elements were rooted in this blend of traditional beliefs and religious interpretations.
Yeah, it's wild how these cultural and intellectual trends all kind of intersect and influence each other.
Absolutely. And to delve even deeper into this dynamic, we should talk about the secretive nature of magic itself and how its exposure often fueled persecution.
Right, because magic kind of thrives on secrecy. Like if everyone knew your tricks, it wouldn't be so magical, right?
Exactly. But when those secrets were revealed, it could really backfire on the practitioner.
Give me an example.
Well, think about it. A disgruntled client seeking revenge, a misplaced book of spells falling into the wrong hands,
No.
or even just being seen with individuals who are, known for dabbling in the occult.
It's like living under constant suspicion.
Right. One wrong move, and your whole world could come crashing down. And this fear of exposure, it helps explain why accusations often centered on, the perceived harm caused by magic.
We're talking about maleficent.
Exactly.
Essentially any act of magical harm.
Yes, any act of magical harm inflicted on someone or something. We're talking making someone sick, ruining crops, causing accidents, like messing with people's lives.
And that was a big no-no.
Absolutely. And this is especially true in pre-modern Europe, where disease, misfortune, natural disasters were constant threats.
Right.
People were quick to blame the unexplainable on sorcery. If something bad happened and there wasn't a clear explanation, boom, sorcery.
It was like the go-to explanation. And our sources show us that this led to a huge increase in prosecutions for maleficem, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries. But why then? What happened that caused this sudden surge?
It's a good question. And to understand it, we have to look at how theological interpretations of magic were evolving during this time, particularly the emergence of what they call the diabolical pact.
Okay, so this is where the church steps in, right? They weren't just saying that magic was bad. They wanted to explain how it actually worked, how it could have a real impact.
Exactly. And they brought in the big guns for this. They brought in the devil. The church argued that magic couldn't work on its own.
Oh, interesting.
They believed that demons were actually carrying out the magician's wishes.
So it wasn't like someone casting a spell and poof, something bad happened. There was this whole unseen world of demons pulling the strings.
Precisely. They argued that demons were granting power to the magician in exchange for their soul. So it wasn't just about causing harm, it was about making a deal with evil itself.
Which kind of makes you wonder, did people actually believe they were making deals with the devil, or was it more like an unconscious thing? You know, they were using folk remedies or charms without realizing the supposed demonic involvement.
That's where things get a little fuzzy.
Fuzzy how?
Well, the sources talk about this distinction between like what they call implicit and explicit pacts.
Okay, implicit versus explicit. Lay it on me.
An implicit pact meant someone was basically clueless. They're going about their business, using traditional remedies or charms, but totally unaware of the supposed demonic involvement.
Okay, so they're playing with fire, but they don't even know it.
Exactly. Then you have explicit pacts, where someone's actively seeking out the devil's help, consciously choosing to align themselves with evil.
Which obviously makes them a much bigger target, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But proving someone had made an explicit pact, that was tricky.
Because how do you prove that?
Exactly. It's subjective, right? And that's precisely why the blurring of these distinctions played such a crucial role in shaping the witch hunts.
It created this atmosphere of paranoia, like anyone messing with magic, even innocently, could be accused of being in league with the devil.
Exactly.
So if you thought you're the victim of harmful magic, what could you do? Did you just have to sit there and take it?
Well, actually, there were countermeasures people used to try to protect themselves. And
Right.
It wasn't all just like witch burning and stuff.
So what did they do? Spill the tea?
Well, it depended on the threat and what people believed. Some relied on practical solutions like, treating injuries or seeking out like traditional medical care.
Okay, so they weren't all running straight to the stake.
No. Some turned to more spiritual methods like prayer, divination, wearing amulets for protection.
So they had their ways of fighting back.
They did. And then there were these people called cunning folk.
Cunning folk, what's that all about?
They were fascinating. They had knowledge of herbs, healing practices, and even some magical rituals.
Okay.
Some would offer their services to identify witches, provide counter curses, or even help people, communicate with spirits.
So they were kind of like magical troubleshooters.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They walked this fine line between helpful neighbor and, suspected witch.
I see.
But their very existence highlights this complex mix of belief and skepticism that existed. Because not everyone was buying into the whole witchcraft thing,
Right. Not everyone was on board. But, and this is a big question, why did witchcraft prosecutions increase so dramatically in the early modern period? We've talked about some things, but what's the deal?
Well, historians are still debating that. There's no simple answer. But what's interesting is that despite the increase in prosecutions, there was still skepticism about witchcraft.
Oh, so it wasn't everyone just blindly accepting witches and demons and all that?
No, definitely not. There were folks raising doubts, questioning the evidence.
Good for them. Were there like any big names in this skepticism movement?
Yeah, even within the church itself, there were skeptics. Like, check out a document called the Canon Episcopi.
Okay, the Canon Episcopi, lay it on me.
This goes back to the 10th century. And it straight up questioned the reality of some witchcraft beliefs, things like witches flying and attending those Sabbaths.
Really?
They suggested that those experiences were probably more like illusions or demonic tricks.
So even back then, they were considering the possibility of, like, mental illness or delusion.
They were. And get this. People kept referencing and debating the canon episcopi for centuries, even as witch hunts were on the rise. It really shows this constant tension between traditional beliefs and these emerging doubts and a more rational way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's like people were trying to figure out, like, where's the line between what's real and what's in our heads.
Exactly.
And I guess as skepticism grew, it started to impact the legal system, too.
You got it. We see these legal challenges starting to emerge. People are raising questions about the validity of the evidence being used in trials.
Right, because a lot of it was based on witness testimony. Right.
Yeah, and a lot of times that testimony was obtained under duress or even torture.
Which, let's be honest, if you're being tortured, you're going to say whatever they want to hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Critics argued that this reliance on coerced confessions really undermined the whole legal system. Like one critic, Friedrich Spee, wrote a book called The Cautio Criminalis, which exposed the use of torture and argued for, a more just approach.
Right. So even in this time of fear and paranoia, there were people speaking up for reason and fairness.
They were. And these legal challenges, they started to chip away at the foundation of the witch hunts.
Right. And it's important to remember that all of this was happening against a backdrop of incredible diversity across Europe.
And absolutely. Each region had its own set of legal traditions, cultural beliefs, and social dynamics. It's like a huge tapestry, with each thread representing a unique set of factors.
So let's talk specifics. You mentioned Germany earlier. What was going on with witch hunts in that region?
Germany, well, it was a hotbed of religious and political turmoil, especially during the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation really stirred things up, and in some areas it really fueled the intensity of the witch hunts.
So it's not just about, like, superstition or ignorance, it's about power and control.
Exactly. And in Germany, this played out in the writings of a demonologist named Peter Binsfeld.
Okay, Peter Binsfeld.
He was convinced that all magic, no matter what, was evil and stemmed from a pact of the devil. No gray areas for him.
Wow, that's pretty hardcore.
It was, and his views were really influential. But he wasn't without his critics. Another scholar, Cornelius Loos, argued for a more nuanced understanding.
So Luce is like, hold on, not all magic is evil.
Exactly. He suggested that some folks might be using, like, folk remedies or traditional knowledge without any bad intentions. He even suggested that magic could be used for good.
What a concept.
Right. And this debate between Binsfeld and Luce really highlights how intellectual trends could influence not only personal beliefs, but also, like, legal practices and social attitudes.
But as these debates raged on in Germany, what was happening elsewhere? What about France?
Well, in France, the Paris Parlement played a big role in handling witchcraft cases.
The Paris Parlement, that was like their high court, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And historians have debated for ages whether they were, like, lenient or severe compared to other courts.
What do the sources tell us?
They were definitely more cautious than some local courts, often overturning convictions based on, like, shaky evidence or confessions obtained under torture. They actually tried to standardize procedures for witchcraft trials.
So even though the fear of witchcraft was still rampant, there was this push for more, like, due process.
Yes, it was a step toward fairness. And this emphasis on procedure, along with the growing skepticism, seems to have played a role in the eventual decline of prosecutions in France.
Okay, so France is starting to chill out a bit. Let's talk about the Netherlands then. They went from intense witch hunting to a pretty rapid decline. What was their secret?
Well, one of the most interesting factors was the rise of skepticism about demonic power. People were starting to think, hey, maybe the devil doesn't have as much control as we thought.
Interesting.
And there was a growing emphasis on individual religious experience. People were focusing more on their own personal connection to God.
So it wasn't just a rejection of religion, it was a shift in how they viewed their faith.
Exactly. Remember, this is the era of the Reformation. Lots of changes happening in the religious landscape. And this shift, it seems to have played a part in undermining that whole belief in demonic pacts, which was, central to most accusations.
It makes you wonder if there are similar shifts happening today, like how do our changing beliefs and ideas shape how we respond to things we fear or don't understand?
I like that. Something to think about.
But we'll come back to that later. For now, let's talk about the Roman Inquisition. I always thought they were more about rooting out heresy and dissent, not witches. Were they really involved in witch hunts?
You might be surprised to hear this, but the Roman Inquisition, they often took a more nuanced approach to magic and witchcraft than their counterparts in Spain or Portugal. They weren't just throwing everyone accused of sorcery into the flames.
Really?
They really believed in witchcraft, of course, but they also recognized that not all magic was inherently bad. They looked at the intent, the potential harm.
So it was a bit more sophisticated than just magic equals evil.
It was. For example, they might give lighter punishments for things like divination or love magic. They considered those less dangerous than, full-on demonic sorcery.
So they were saying, okay, you might be messing with magic, but we're not going to burn you at the stake for trying to find love.
Exactly. It's a more nuanced approach than we might expect, given the reputation.
Right. But let's, for a minute, step outside the courtroom and talk about how witchcraft showed up in literature, especially in the early modern period. How did writers and playwrights incorporate those anxieties into their work?
That's a really interesting question. Early modern literature gives us this amazing glimpse into how those beliefs were woven into the culture.
And you know what's fascinating? They were looking back to the classics, like ancient Greek and Roman texts with those powerful witches like Medea and Hecate. It's like a direct link to that fear of female power and magic stretching back centuries.
Yeah, there's a lineage there, for sure. And those figures, they still capture our imaginations today, which I think says something about how those anxieties about female power, magic, and societal disruption really run deep.
And we can't forget about Shakespeare. He was totally into witchcraft. Think about Macbeth, for example. Why do you think he included those elements in his plays?
Shakespeare, like all great artists, tapped into the anxieties of his time. His use of witchcraft wasn't just for drama. It was a way to explore themes of ambition, fate, the dangers of power. And remember, he was writing during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a powerful woman who, defied a lot of expectations.
Yeah.
So it's easy to see how his portrayal of witches, like those weird sisters in Macbeth, might have resonated with audiences who were, trying to make sense of those changing gender dynamics.
Like he was holding up a mirror to society, showing them the dark side of power and ambition.
Exactly. And to understand those consequences even better, we need to talk about gender. It was a huge factor in all of this.
Okay, let's talk about it. We know that women were the primary targets of these accusations. But why?
That's the million-dollar question. It comes down to how women were viewed, in a patriarchal world where their roles were so tightly defined.
As wives, daughters, mothers, anyone stepping outside those lines was suspect.
Exactly. And magic, particularly healing magic, childbirth, folk remedies, that was seen as women's work. And that power, well, it made them vulnerable in a society that wanted to control women.
It's like they were trapped. Damned if they did, damned if they didn't. If they had healing knowledge, great. If something went wrong, suddenly they're a witch.
And this vulnerability wasn't universal. It depended on the social context, religious beliefs, and even the historical moment.
I see.
In Puritan New England, for example, with their strict moral code, any woman who stepped out of line could find herself accused of witchcraft.
And it was all rooted in that fear of female power, right?
To a large extent, yes. But to really understand it, we need to get specific. We need to talk about Salem.
Okay, Salem. Those trials are like a textbook example of what happens when fear and hysteria take over. What lessons can we learn from Salem?
Salem shows us how social anxieties, religious extremism, and personal grudges can create this perfect storm of suspicion and persecution.
Right.
Those young women who said they were afflicted by witchcraft, their accusations weren't just teenage drama.
So it's not just a case of bored girls making up stories.
Not at all. Their accusations reflected these much deeper anxieties brewing in Salem Village. Fears of invasion from Native American tribes, religious extremism, and power struggles within the community itself.
So they were using witchcraft accusations to, address their own personal or political agendas.
Exactly. And the tragedy of Salem is that the accused were usually the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Older women, social outcasts, those who didn't conform.
The classic scapegoating scenario. Find someone to blame for all the bad stuff.
And it shows how even in a supposedly rational and just society, fear and suspicion can run wild with devastating consequences. It's a powerful reminder that those instincts are still within us. And it's something to keep in mind as we dig deeper into this history. Because the story of witch hunts isn't just about Europe or America, it's a global phenomenon, with its own variations and nuances.
Right, and that's a story for next time. Stay tuned, deep divers. We'll be back to explore those global dimensions of the witch hunts in part 2. See you then.
Bye for now. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of witchcraft. Last time we were talking about Salem and how those trials really highlight the dangers of, like, mass hysteria and scapegoating.
Yeah, it's crazy how a small village in New England can teach us so much about, human nature and how fear can just take over. But Salem is just one part of this much bigger story. As we explore the history of witch hunts, we need to broaden our view. Like, look beyond Europe and colonial America. What about other parts of the world? Did witchcraft beliefs and accusations look different in other cultures?
Oh, absolutely. Witchcraft beliefs are super diverse. They
Yeah.
reflect those specific cultures and societies where they, pop up. What might be witchcraft in one place could be seen as, like, healing or a spiritual practice in another.
Right, we can't just assume everyone sees it the same way.
Exactly. Even the very definition of a witch can vary widely. So we can't just impose our modern Western ideas onto other cultures, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, what are some examples of how these beliefs showed up differently in different parts of the world?
Okay, so let's take Africa, for example.
Mm.
In many African cultures, witchcraft is often connected to traditional beliefs about spirits, ancestors, and, like, the balance of nature. It's not always seen as, like, inherently evil.
Really?
A lot of traditional healers and diviners, they use their knowledge of the spirit world to heal people, protect communities, ensure good harvests, all sorts of things.
So it's not this black and white good versus evil thing that we often see in Western depictions of witchcraft.
Right, it's way more nuanced. It's part of everyday life.
Okay, so it's more complex than just good versus evil. And even when there are accusations, it's more about social dynamics, right? Like explaining misfortune or power struggles.
Exactly. It's like when things go wrong, people look for someone to blame. It's a human thing, you know?
Right. Makes you wonder, what about Asia? How did witchcraft beliefs play out there?
Well, Asia's a huge continent with tons of different traditions, so it's hard to generalize. But in many parts, there are beliefs in spirits, demons, and, like, supernatural forces that can be used for good or bad.
So it's like Africa, there's this recognition that magic can be used for different purposes.
Exactly. And the idea of a witch is often different. Like, in some Asian cultures, they have shamans who can enter trance states and talk to spirits and heal people.
Shamans, interesting.
Yeah, they can be revered for their powers, but sometimes they're also feared.
Because those powers could be used for bad stuff too.
Right, it all comes back to the context and the intentions.
Okay, so we've been talking about how these beliefs show up differently around the world. Let's bring it back to Europe for a sec. We've been talking about how women were the main targets of witch accusations, but were men ever accused?
Absolutely. It wasn't just women. And the reasons why men were accused, those can be really telling.
Okay, so if it wasn't always about gender, what else might cause a man to get accused of witchcraft?
Remember how we talked about how women were seen as powerful in the realm of healing and, like, folk magic, and how that made them vulnerable? Well, sometimes the same logic was applied to men who had authority or influence.
So if a man was seen as like too powerful or threatening, or if he was rocking the boat, he could become a target.
Exactly. It could be a man who was super successful in business or politics. People might accuse him of using witchcraft to get ahead.
Right.
Or a man who, criticized the church or the government.
So it wasn't always about gender. It was about like challenging the status quo, sticking your neck out.
Yeah, it's all about power dynamics, who has it, and who's trying to keep it.
Are there like any examples of this in the source material? Any specific cases that really jumped out?
Yeah, there are a few. One that's really fascinating is the trial of Urbain Grandier. He was a French priest accused of witchcraft back in the 17th century.
New priest. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, he was this really charismatic guy, but also kind of controversial. He wasn't afraid to criticize the church. And he was rumored to be a bit of a ladies' man.
So not exactly your typical quiet, obedient priest. Sounds like he might have rubbed some people the wrong way.
He did. And things came to a head when these nuns at a local convent started having fits and hallucinations, claiming that Grandier was sending demons to possess them.
Oh, wow. So those accusations were politically motivated, right? Someone wanted to take him down.
It seems that way. And it worked. He was found guilty and burned at the stake in 1634.
Tragic. It's just crazy how religious beliefs could be used like that as a weapon against someone.
Yeah, and his case really shows the danger of mixing religion and politics, and how accusations of witchcraft could silence anyone who, challenged the powers that be.
So it's a story about power. and how it corrupts.
Exactly. But let's shift gears for a minute. Remember how we were talking about the Netherlands and how they saw a decline in witch prosecutions? Well, even as the courts were becoming more skeptical, were there still like anxieties about witchcraft floating around?
Yeah, good point. I mean, just because the legal system was changing doesn't mean people's beliefs disappeared overnight.
Right. In some places, especially rural communities, those beliefs definitely stuck around, but they morphed and adapted to the changing times.
So instead of accusing their neighbor of being a witch, people found other ways to explain the bad things that happened.
Yeah, exactly. There was a growing interest in natural philosophy, trying to understand the world through science and observation. But that didn't totally erase belief in the supernatural.
Right. I guess those two things can exist side by side. Like, were there any specific examples of this blending of science and superstition?
Oh, yeah, tons. Like magnetism was a big one in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
It was still this mysterious force that people didn't really understand.
Mm.
And some believed it could be harnessed for good or evil.
So instead of blaming a bad harvest on a witch, they might blame it on, like, bad vibes or, negative energy.
Well, maybe not vibes exactly, but more like some kind of magnetic disturbance. And this fascination with magnetism extended to the human body, too. Some thought certain people had, like, magnetic powers that could influence others.
It's like they were replacing witches with, I don't know, mind control or something. The fears are the same, just the explanations change.
Exactly. It shows how people are always trying to make sense of the world, even if it means blending, science and superstition. But while the Netherlands was moving away from witch prosecutions, other parts of Europe were, they were going in a different direction.
You mean things were heating up in other places?
Yeah, some regions were still in the thick of it, like Switzerland, for example. In the late 17th century, they had a wave of intense persecution, all driven by, religious fervor, social anxieties, political rivalries, the whole shebang.
So, same old story, different location. What was it about Switzerland that made them so uh, gung-ho about witch hunting?
Well, Switzerland at the time was made up of all these independent cantons, and each one had its own laws and religious beliefs. It was pretty decentralized, which could lead to like inconsistencies in how they dealt with witchcraft cases.
So some cantons were more hardcore than others.
Yeah, and this could actually cause conflicts between neighboring regions.
Wow, it's like Europe in miniature, all those different approaches playing out in one small country.
You could say that. And in Switzerland, these issues were often intensified by religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants.
Oh yeah, the Reformation was still causing ripples.
Exactly. And they would use accusations of witchcraft against each other, like a weapon. It shows how these beliefs were tied to power struggles and religious dominance.
It's always about power, isn't it? So, were there like any big names driving those Swiss witch hunts?
Yeah, one of the key figures was Johann Weyer. He was a demonologist, but kind of a complicated guy. He believed in demons and witchcraft, but he also thought that many people accused of it were actually mentally ill or delusional.
So he was like, hold on, maybe not everyone's in league with the devil.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time in some ways. Yeah. He didn't like the use of torture to get confessions either. But his writings also contributed to the demonization of witches. He described demonic pacts and the supposed powers of witches in great detail.
So even as he was trying to be more rational, he was still adding fuel to the fire.
It's a tricky balance, right? Especially in a time when science, religion, and superstition were all mixed up.
Right, it's like they were still figuring out how the world worked. But as we get into the 17th and 18th centuries, those lines start to become clearer, right? Like with the rise of scientific thinking and the Enlightenment, those supernatural explanations started to lose their power.
Yeah, you're right. Those shifts in thinking changed how people understood witchcraft, both in Europe and the Americas. And those anxieties about, invasion and social upheaval, they didn't just vanish.
Right, they just took on new forms.
Exactly. As science progressed, those supernatural explanations became less and less believable.
But did that mean people stopped believing in witchcraft, or did those beliefs just morph into something new?
That's the big question. And it's one we'll tackle in the final part of our deep dive. Because even though witch hunts declined, that human need to blame someone, to find easy answers, that didn't go away.
So those anxieties found new targets, new outlets.
They did. And we'll explore how all that played out next time in part 3.
Welcome back, deep divers. It's wild to think that, like, even as witch hunts were declining, all those anxieties, those fears, they didn't just disappear,
You're right, they didn't. It's more like they shifted, they adapted.
It's almost like like a game of whack-a-mole, you know? You knock down one fear and another one pops up somewhere else. So like if we weren't burning witches at the stake anymore, how did these anxieties show up, in the modern world?
Well, think about that basic human impulse, right? The need to blame bad things on outside forces, to find easy answers for complex problems. That doesn't just go away.
Right, it's easier to point the finger than to like actually look inward.
Exactly. So instead of witches, the targets might change. Maybe it's a marginalized group, someone perceived as different or threatening.
So instead of blaming, I don't know, a bad harvest on a witch's curse, people might blame it on oh, I don't know, immigrants stealing jobs or something.
Yeah, the target shifts, but that underlying fear, that need for a scapegoat, it's still there.
It's kind of depressing, actually.
It is. And it can be really dangerous, especially during times of like social unrest or uncertainty. It's a pattern that we see over and over again in history. Think about, the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century.
Yeah, those are some pretty dark examples.
They are. And it's a reminder that we're not as far removed from those witch hunt mentalities as we might like to think.
So what about the legacy of witch hunts? Is it just like a chapter in a history book, or is it something we should still be like thinking about today?
I think it's definitely something we should be thinking about. It's a cautionary tale about, power, justice, the dangers of letting fear and prejudice run wild.
It shows what can happen when a society loses its cool. Even supposedly educated and enlightened societies can fall prey to these kinds of things.
You're absolutely right. Think about, like, the McCarthy era in the U.S. during the Cold War. The fear of communism led to all these accusations, blacklisting, ruined lives, all based on, very little evidence.
It's scary how easily fear can be manipulated, how quickly it can turn into this witch hunt mentality.
And the consequences, they can be devastating. Broken lives, shattered communities, a legacy of injustice that can last for generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I guess the big question is, what can we learn from all this? How do we, prevent these kinds of things from happening again?
I think it starts with critical thinking, questioning assumptions, demanding evidence, and most importantly, recognizing the humanity of those who are different from us.
It's about empathy, putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
Exactly. And remembering that history isn't just like a bunch of names and dates in a textbook. It's a mirror reflecting our own, vulnerabilities, our capacity for both good and evil.
It's a story about us, about who we are.
And who we could become if we're not careful.
So to our deep divers out there, are we really free from those anxieties that fueled the witch hunts? Or are those fears just, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to pop up in new ways?
It's something to think about. We may not be burning witches anymore, but the forces that drove those persecutions, the fear, the ignorance, they're still around. It's up to all of us to be vigilant, to challenge those impulses, and to create a world where justice and reason and compassion win out.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it as insightful and as mind-blowing as we did.
Yeah, and keep asking questions. Keep learning. That's what it's all about.